November 1965, a remote valley in Vietnam. Two worlds are about to collide in ways that would reshape modern warfare forever. But this isn't a story about victory or defeat. It's a story about men pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance. The Ia Drang Valley was nothing but dense jungle, hidden from satellite view, tucked deep in the Central Highlands. American commanders believed it was empty. They were catastrophically wrong. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore received his orders with grim certainty. Land a small force, just 450 men, in a clearing codenamed LZ X-Ray. Search for enemy troops. What waited for them in that jungle would test everything they believed about warfare. November 14th, 1965. Dawn breaks over the valley. The helicopter rotors cut through humid air as the first transport birds descended toward the landing zone. The men gripped their rifles, their young faces tight with focus. Moore jumped first. His boots hit the red earth. Within minutes, 450 men were on the ground, spreading into defensive positions around the clearing. The operation felt clean, controlled, professional. Everything was going according to plan. But 500 meters away, hidden in the dense jungle, something else was happening. An entire North Vietnamese army regiment, nearly 2,000 soldiers, had been waiting in those trees for exactly this moment. General Vo Nguyen Giap, the architect of the Vietnamese resistance, had positioned his forces with patient precision. He had been fighting the French for years. He had learned their tactics. He had learned American tactics too. And now he would show them what they had not accounted for. The first shots came at 10:30 a.m. Not from a distance, from close range. The enemy had let the Americans land. They had let them spread out. They had let them believe they were safe. Then they struck with overwhelming force. Contact left, contact right, they're everywhere. The radio crackled with urgent voices. What had seemed like empty jungle moments before was now alive with enemy fire. Moore realized with sickening clarity. His force was surrounded. 450 Americans, pinned in a football field-sized clearing, facing 2,000 enemy soldiers emerging from every direction. The odds were impossible. The mathematics of survival looked grim, but Moore did something extraordinary. Instead of retreating, instead of calling for immediate extraction, he made a decision that would define the next 72 hours. He would hold the ground. He would fight. The jungle erupted into chaos. Muzzle flashes lit the undergrowth. The sound was overwhelming, a constant roar of gunfire, grenades, and screaming voices. Soldiers fell on both sides. The clearing became a killing field. Moore called for reinforcements. Not just soldiers. He called for Bravo Company, another 450 men, to be inserted into the same landing zone under heavy fire. It was a desperate gamble. They would either break the siege or be slaughtered. The helicopters came in hot. Soldiers jumped from the skids before the birds could fully land. Bullets tore through the fuselage. One helicopter was hit so badly, it barely made it back to base. But Bravo Company was on the ground. The American force had doubled. Through the first night, the Americans dug in. Every man knew that without reinforcements by morning, they would be overrun. The darkness was the enemy's advantage. They moved through it like phantoms, infiltration tactics, ambushes, wave after wave of attacks. Moore walked the perimeter. Calm, focused. He checked ammunition, encouraged his men, called in artillery strikes that lit the sky like hellfire. Officers like this, leaders who could maintain clarity in apocalyptic chaos, were rare. His men would follow him anywhere, but the North Vietnamese were learning too. They adapted. They pressed harder. The second night was even more violent than the first. The Americans were running low on ammunition. Medical supplies were nearly gone. And still, the enemy came. What sustained these men wasn't hope. It was duty. It was the knowledge that if they broke, everyone died. So they held. They fired. They called in airstrikes that turned sections of jungle into infernos. By the morning of November 15th, a new force arrived. The 2nd Battalion, Vietnam's most elite unit, had been ordered to break through the jungle to relieve LZ X-ray. They fought through ambush after ambush, every meter of jungle disputed with bullets and bayonets. When they finally broke through the tree line at first light, the sight was apocalyptic. The clearing was scorched. Bodies lay where they had fallen. American casualties, 79 killed. But the siege was broken. The North Vietnamese withdrew deeper into the jungle. Giap had learned what he needed. Americans could be killed in large numbers. His army could stand against them. But the cost was staggering. Over 600 of his soldiers lay dead. On November 17th, another engagement erupted just miles away, at a place called Landing Zone Albany. American soldiers were caught in the open again. The fighting was just as brutal, the casualties just as severe. In 3 days of continuous combat, American forces suffered 229 killed and 242 wounded. But North Vietnamese losses were calculated in the thousands. By every measure, casualties inflicted, enemy degraded, terrain held, the Americans had won. Yet something profound had changed in the minds of American military planners. They had discovered that the enemy could mass forces, that they could orchestrate complex operations, that they could inflict massive casualties even in defeat. The victory at Ia Drang became the template for what would be called the attritional strategy. Wear down the enemy through superior firepower and body count. It seemed logical, it seemed winnable, and it would define the next decade of war. But there was a cost that couldn't be measured in casualties. The North Vietnamese had proven they could survive direct confrontation, and they would only grow stronger, more organized, more committed. This battle had become a mirror. Each side saw what they wanted to see. For the Americans, it was proof they could defeat the North. For the North Vietnamese, it was proof they could absorb punishment and endure. Both sides left Ia Drang convinced they could eventually prevail. The men who fought there, the 450 at LZ X-ray, the reinforcements, the relieving force, they didn't think about grand strategy or historical significance. They thought about survival, about their brothers, about the weight of their rifles and the silence of their fallen. Ia Drang was the first major engagement of the Vietnam War. It would not be the last. For the next 10 years, battles would continue. Young men would continue to die, and the valley would fade into memory for most, while remaining etched forever in the hearts of those who were there. The Ia Drang Valley today is quiet again. Trees have grown back over the scarred earth, but the lessons about courage, about the limits of firepower, about the human cost of war, those lessons remain. And they remind us why we must never forget the men who fought in those jungles, on that blood-soaked ground, in a battle that changed everything.